Nobody ever connects the dots the way they actually should be connected. A missed deadline gets blamed on a demanding job. A friendship that quietly dissolved gets chalked up to people simply growing apart. A living space that used to feel put together now sits in a state of low-grade disorder that never quite gets addressed. An avoidant experiencing all of this rarely traces any of it back to its actual source, because the actual source, losing someone whose presence had been quietly, invisibly organizing far more of their life than either of them ever realized, doesn't announce itself the way a single, obvious crisis would. It shows up instead as a slow, distributed unraveling across areas of life that seem, on the surface, to have nothing to do with the relationship at all. This is what this exploration is actually about, not simply the emotional aftermath of losing someone, which has already been explored thoroughly elsewhere, but the considerably less obvious, considerably more structural collapse that tends to follow, the way an avoidant's entire practical life, their work, their friendships, their home, their health, their basic daily functioning can quietly deteriorate in the wake of a loss. They may never consciously connect to any of it. Anyone listening who has wondered whether their presence in an avoidance life actually mattered beyond the relationship itself, whether it held together something larger and more practical than either of them ever consciously acknowledged, deserves to understand exactly how significant that role often turns out to have been, revealed only in hindsight, through the specific, cascading ways everything else in an avoidance life can begin to erode once that presence is gone. It's worth naming briefly why this particular framing, focusing on practical and structural collapse rather than purely emotional aftermath, deserves its own dedicated exploration rather than being folded into a more general discussion of avoidant grief. Emotional aftermath, however real and significant, tends to receive considerably more attention in general conversation about breakups and loss, partly because it's more immediately visible and more easily discussed in familiar emotional terms. The structural, practical dimension explored throughout this piece receives far less attention, despite often producing consequences that are, in their own way, just as significant, sometimes even more consequential in terms of their lasting, real-world impact on someone's actual daily functioning and quality of life. To understand why this happens, it helps to introduce a concept worth naming clearly from the outset, the idea of relational scaffolding, a role that extends considerably beyond emotional support into the more practical, structural architecture of someone's daily life. Scaffolding, in the literal sense, is the temporary structure that holds a building upright and in shape while it's being constructed or repaired, invisible to anyone simply looking at the finished result, but absolutely essential to whether that structure holds its shape while everything underneath remains under construction. Many avoidants, without ever consciously realizing it, rely on a partner to serve exactly this kind of scaffolding function, not simply emotionally, but practically, across nearly every domain of their daily life. This scaffolding function tends to be almost entirely invisible while the relationship exists, precisely because it operates through countless small, unremarkable contributions, rather than through any single, obvious form of support. It's worth pausing to name why this invisibility specifically tends to make the eventual collapse so much more disorienting once it finally arrives, both for the avoidant experiencing it and for anyone trying to understand it from the outside. Visible, obvious forms of support tend to be replaced or compensated for relatively quickly once they're removed, precisely because their absence is immediately apparent and therefore immediately addressable. Invisible scaffolding, by contrast, tends to go unaddressed for considerably longer, simply because nobody, including the avoidant themselves, initially recognizes that anything specific has actually been removed. This delay in recognition is precisely what allows the collapse to spread so broadly across so many seemingly unrelated domains before anyone, including the person experiencing it most directly, manages to trace the pattern back to its actual singular source. It includes things like the simple existence of shared routines, regular mealtimes, regular sleep schedules, a general rhythm to the week that develops naturally around two people's overlapping lives, rather than requiring either person to consciously construct and maintain that rhythm entirely on their own. It includes social scaffolding as well, friendships and family relationships that often get maintained, at least in part, through a partner's ongoing effort and initiative, plans made, invitations extended, birthdays remembered, a whole social infrastructure that continues functioning smoothly, partly because someone is quietly tending to it in the background. It includes physical and environmental scaffolding too, the shared responsibility of maintaining a living space, a home that stays reasonably organised and functional, partly because two people are sharing the ongoing labour of keeping it that way, rather than one person bearing that entire responsibility alone. And it includes a kind of practical decision-making scaffolding as well, a partner's presence, often functioning as an informal sounding board or a source of accountability for countless small daily decisions: what to eat, when to go to bed, whether to follow through on some intention or plan, a role that, once removed, leaves considerably more decision-making weight resting entirely on one person's own, sometimes underdeveloped capacity for self-direction and self-discipline. For many avoidants specifically, this scaffolding function tends to be particularly significant, precisely because their own relational patterns often involve keeping other relationships, friendships, family ties at a somewhat greater distance than a partner typically maintains them. It's worth naming why this particular vulnerability tends to be so specifically pronounced for avoidants compared to people with other attachment styles, since the scaffolding dynamic described throughout this exploration isn't entirely unique to this population, but tends to manifest with unusual intensity within it. People with more secure attachment patterns generally maintain a broader, more evenly distributed network of close relationships throughout their adult life, which means the loss of any single relationship, even a significant romantic one, doesn't carry quite the same concentrated singular weight. Avoidants, by contrast, often channel a disproportionate share of their closest, most trusted connection into a single romantic partnership, precisely because maintaining multiple, equally close relationships would require a level of ongoing vulnerability and effort their usual defenses are organised around minimising. This concentration is exactly what makes the eventual loss so structurally significant, removing not simply one relationship among several, but often the single most load-bearing relationship in an entire otherwise sparse network. This means a partner frequently ends up serving as a kind of central hub, connecting an avoidant to a broader social and practical world they might not otherwise maintain nearly as actively on their own. Remove that hub, and the connections it was quietly holding together don't simply continue functioning smoothly on their own. They often begin to fray, sometimes gradually, sometimes with startling speed, precisely because the effort required to maintain them was never actually being distributed as evenly as either person might have assumed while the relationship still existed. There's a metaphor worth holding here. Picture a single support beam running through a house, one that isn't load-bearing in any dramatic, obvious sense, but that nonetheless connects and stabilizes several smaller structural elements throughout the building, elements that seem, individually, capable of standing on their own. Remove that single beam, and nothing collapses immediately or dramatically. Instead, small cracks begin appearing gradually across seemingly unrelated parts of the structure. A door that no longer closes quite right, a wall that develops a hairline fracture, a floor that starts to feel slightly less stable underfoot. None of it traceable at first glance back to the single beam that used to be quietly holding everything in alignment. This is close to what tends to happen across an avoidant's practical life once the specific person who was serving this scaffolding function is gone. A slow, distributed series of small failures across areas of life that seem, individually, to have nothing to do with the relationship's ending at all. It's worth pausing here to offer something important to anyone listening who has wondered whether their presence in an avoidance life was ever genuinely significant, given how little direct acknowledgement or gratitude that presence may have received while the relationship still existed. The scaffolding function being described throughout this exploration is often significant precisely because of how invisible it was, both to the avoidant benefiting from it and often to the person providing it, who may not have fully recognized how much practical, structural support they were actually offering until its absence produced visible, undeniable consequences on the other side. Consider first how this collapse tends to manifest specifically within an avoidance professional life, since work is often one of the earliest, most visible domains where this scaffolding failure becomes apparent, precisely because professional performance tends to require exactly the kind of sustained focus, routine, and self-discipline that relational scaffolding often quietly supported. An avoidant who previously maintained reasonably consistent work performance may begin experiencing a noticeable decline, missed deadlines, decreased attention to detail, a general erosion of the structured routine that used to support consistent professional functioning. This decline often puzzles the avoidant themselves, since nothing about their actual job or its demands has changed, leaving them without an obvious explanation for why performance that used to feel manageable now feels considerably more difficult to sustain. This professional decline tends to be particularly disorienting because it often threatens something an avoidant has typically relied upon as a stable, dependable source of identity and self-worth, competence and achievement in their professional life, an area many avoidants prioritize precisely because it offers a sense of accomplishment and control that feels safer and more predictable than the emotional vulnerability required by close relationships. Watching this previously reliable domain begin to falter as well, in the aftermath of a relationship's ending, can produce a particularly acute kind of distress, a sense that even the areas of life an avoidant has always been able to count on are no longer functioning the way they used to. It helps to name a few specific ways this professional decline tends to manifest, because the connection between a relationship's ending and workplace performance can otherwise feel abstract enough to dismiss or overlook. One common manifestation involves a noticeable decline in the kind of sustained concentration that complex or detail-oriented work requires, tasks that used to take a predictable amount of focused effort now stretching out considerably longer, or requiring multiple attempts to complete accurately, as intrusive thoughts and unprocessed emotional material continue surfacing throughout the workday in ways that weren't previously an issue. Another common manifestation involves a decline in the kind of proactive, forward-thinking behaviour that career advancement often depends on, initiative that used to come naturally, now feeling considerably harder to access, opportunities that might once have been pursued actively instead passing by unaddressed, simply because the underlying reserve of energy and motivation that used to support that proactivity has been redirected, largely unconsciously, toward managing the ongoing aftermath of the loss. A further manifestation, somewhat more visible to colleagues and supervisors than the others, involves changes in workplace relationships and general demeanour, an avoidant who was previously reasonably engaged and collegial, becoming more withdrawn, more prone to irritability, less available for the kind of collaborative relational engagement that many workplaces depend on, even when the actual technical quality of their individual work hasn't necessarily declined to the same degree. This particular manifestation often produces consequences that compound over time, strained professional relationships that, left unaddressed, can eventually affect opportunities and advancement considerably beyond whatever initial temporary dip in performance originally set this entire pattern in motion. Consider too how this collapse tends to manifest within an avoidant's broader social world, friendships and family relationships that may have depended more heavily than anyone realised on a partner's ongoing initiative and effort. Before turning to the social dimension specifically, it's worth naming a related, somewhat deeper domain where this same collapse tends to manifest, one involving identity and self-concept rather than any single external area of functioning. Many avoidants, without consciously realising it, derive a meaningful portion of their sense of self from being observed and known consistently by one particular person over an extended period of time. A long-term partner accumulates a kind of ongoing, evolving narrative about who someone is, their habits, their preferences, the small particular details that make up an individual personality, functioning almost like an external memory bank of identity that the avoidant themselves doesn't have to consciously maintain, because someone else is quietly holding and reflecting it back to them. Losing this kind of witness can produce a surprisingly disorienting effect on an avoidant's basic sense of self, a feeling of having become somewhat less defined, less consistently known, once the person who used to hold and reflect that ongoing narrative is no longer present to continue doing so. This isn't the same as the more acute identity confrontation discussed in other explorations of avoidant psychology following significant loss, the kind involving direct confrontation with fear and vulnerability. This is something quieter and more diffuse, a background sense of blurriness or uncertainty about one's own patterns and preferences, previously so reliably reflected back by someone else that maintaining awareness of them independently now requires a kind of conscious effort that was never actually necessary before. This particular domain often goes almost entirely unnamed, even by the avoidant experiencing it, because it doesn't produce any single, obvious symptom the way professional decline or physical health changes might. It shows up instead as a subtle, persistent sense of not quite knowing oneself as clearly as before, a diffuse discomfort that's easy to misattribute to general stress or sadness, rather than tracing it back to this specific, quieter loss of consistent, long-term reflection that a stable partnership had been providing all along. Social gatherings that used to happen regularly may become less frequent, not through any conscious decision to withdraw, but simply because the person who used to organize and initiate them is no longer present to continue doing so. Friendships that felt stable and secure may begin to feel increasingly distant, not because anything specific went wrong, but because the regular contact and effort required to maintain genuine closeness was never actually being sustained equally by both people involved. This particular decline often catches an avoidant, especially off guard, because it tends to unfold slowly enough that its connection to the relationship's ending isn't immediately obvious. Months might pass before an avoidant notices, with genuine surprise, how much smaller and quieter their social world has become, without ever fully connecting that shrinkage back to the specific loss that set it in motion. It helps to name a few specific patterns within this social decline as well, since they tend to unfold in a fairly recognizable sequence once someone knows to look for them. The earliest stage often involves a simple reduction in frequency, gatherings, and check-ins that used to happen weekly or bi-weekly, gradually stretching to monthly or less, not through any single decision, but through an accumulation of small, individually reasonable postponements. The next stage often involves a shift in who carries the effort of maintaining contact, friendships that previously felt mutual and reciprocal beginning to feel noticeably one-sided, with friends or family members increasingly having to be the ones to reach out first, a role reversal that can feel confusing to everyone involved, since the avoidant themselves may not consciously recognize that they've stopped contributing their previous share of the effort. A later stage, once enough time has passed for this imbalance to become chronic, often involves a genuine, if unintentional, thinning of the social circle itself, friendships that quietly fade due to sustained neglect, sometimes ending not through any conflict or falling out, but simply through mutual, gradual disengagement as one side continues carrying effort that never gets reciprocated closely enough to sustain genuine closeness over time. This particular outcome tends to be one of the more painful, if delayed, consequences of this entire pattern, precisely because it often isn't fully recognized until an avoidant looks around considerably later and realizes how much smaller and more isolated their broader support system has become compared to what it once was. This delayed recognition is worth naming clearly, because it explains why an avoidant might seem, for a considerable period after a relationship ends, to be functioning reasonably well socially, only to experience a more significant, more visible social withdrawal considerably later, once the accumulated effect of reduced effort and initiative has had enough time to genuinely erode connections that once felt secure. There's something worth naming here about the physical, environmental dimension of this collapse as well, because it tends to be one of the more visible, if rarely discussed, consequences of losing this particular kind of scaffolding. Living spaces that were once maintained through shared effort can begin to reflect the absence of that shared labor fairly directly, growing gradually more disorganized, more neglected, sometimes in ways that feel embarrassing or shameful enough that an avoidant actively avoids acknowledging or addressing them, which tends to compound the problem further rather than resolving it. This environmental decline often mirrors, fairly directly, the avoidant's own internal state, external chaos and disorganization reflecting an internal experience that remains largely unprocessed and unacknowledged, precisely because processing it directly would require confronting the loss more honestly than the avoidant's usual defenses are prepared to allow. Health and basic physical self-care often follow a similar trajectory: sleep schedules that grow increasingly irregular, meals that become less consistent or less nutritionally adequate, exercise routines that quietly lapse without any deliberate decision to abandon them. These changes rarely happen all at once, and they rarely announce themselves clearly as consequences of the relationship's ending. They accumulate gradually, small lapses, compounding into a noticeably different, less healthy baseline that an avoidant may not even consciously register as a decline until enough time has passed for the cumulative effect to become undeniable, whether through physical symptoms, through comments from others who notice the change, or through some other, less direct form of confrontation with how significantly their overall functioning has shifted. There's a further domain worth naming specifically because it tends to be one of the more concrete, easily overlooked forms this scaffolding function takes, involving finances and general life logistics. Many relationships, even ones without any formal shared financial arrangement, involve a considerable amount of informal logistical support, reminders about bills or deadlines, shared problem solving around unexpected expenses or complications, a general sense of having someone else available to help think through practical decisions that might otherwise feel overwhelming to navigate entirely alone. Losing this kind of support can produce genuine, measurable consequences: missed payments, disorganized paperwork, decisions made hastily or avoided altogether, simply because the collaborative, shared thinking that used to make them feel manageable is no longer available. This particular domain deserves attention because it tends to produce some of the more objectively serious consequences within this entire pattern: financial strain or logistical chaos that can compound over time in ways considerably more consequential than a slightly messier living space or a slightly less consistent exercise routine. An avoidant experiencing this specific kind of decline may find themselves facing genuinely significant practical difficulties that, once again, rarely get traced back clearly to the relationship's ending, since the connection between losing a partner and struggling with unrelated financial or logistical tasks isn't immediately obvious without the kind of framework this exploration has been building throughout. There's something worth naming about the specific timeline this entire pattern tends to follow, because understanding this timeline helps explain why the connection between the relationship's ending and its cascading practical consequences so often goes unrecognized for a considerable period. The earliest weeks following a significant loss tend to be dominated by more acute, visible emotional distress, the kind already explored thoroughly in other examinations of this topic. During this period, an avoidant's attention and energy remain heavily focused on the emotional impact of the loss itself, which means the more structural, practical consequences described throughout this exploration haven't yet had time to fully accumulate or become visible. It's typically only once this acute emotional period begins to settle, often weeks or months later, that the accumulated effect of reduced routine, reduced social initiative, and reduced practical support becomes noticeable enough to register clearly. This delayed timeline explains why an avoidant might seem to be recovering reasonably well in the initial aftermath of a breakup, only to experience a second, less obviously connected wave of difficulty considerably later. One involving professional decline, social withdrawal, or practical disorganization that seems, on the surface, disconnected from a loss that, by that point, may feel like it happened long enough ago that its continued influence seems implausible. This delayed timeline matters enormously for anyone trying to understand or interpret an avoidant ex-partner's behavior months after a relationship has ended. A visible decline in functioning that appears well after the initial breakup, rather than immediately following it, isn't necessarily evidence of some unrelated cause. It may simply reflect the natural, delayed timeline through which this particular kind of structural, scaffolding-related collapse tends to unfold, considerably slower and less immediately obvious than the more acute emotional distress that tends to dominate attention and conversation in the earlier aftermath of a breakup. It's worth addressing something important here, because this entire pattern, this cascading cross-domain collapse across work, friendships, physical environment, and health, could easily be misread as evidence that the avoidant simply cannot function without a partner. A framing that risks becoming either flattering, in a way that encourages waiting around for their eventual return, or unfairly reductive, in a way that strips the avoidant of any agency or capacity for their own growth and recovery. Neither framing accurately captures what's actually happening here. This collapse doesn't reflect a permanent, inherent incapacity. It reflects the temporary, often painful process of an entire life structure that was never actually built to stand independently, now being forced, by circumstance rather than choice, to discover whether it's capable of doing so. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why this particular period, however difficult and however visibly destabilizing, often represents a genuine opportunity for meaningful growth, assuming the avoidant chooses to engage with it honestly, rather than simply waiting for the collapse to somehow resolve itself, or for a new partner to eventually step into the same scaffolding role their previous partner unknowingly occupied. It helps to name what genuine, healthy rebuilding actually tends to look like in practice, because it's worth distinguishing clearly from behaviour that might superficially resemble progress, without actually representing the kind of durable, independent capacity this exploration has identified as the healthier outcome. Genuine rebuilding tends to involve deliberately, consciously, reconstructing routines, rather than simply drifting until some external circumstance forces structure back into place. Actively scheduling regular contact with friends, rather than waiting passively for others to initiate it. Taking direct ownership of a living space and daily health habits, even when no one else is watching or would notice their absence. This kind of rebuilding tends to feel effortful and somewhat unnatural at first, precisely because it requires consciously performing functions that used to happen automatically, through the relationship's shared structure, without requiring deliberate thought or planning. A key marker distinguishing genuine rebuilding from merely finding a replacement scaffold involves whether the resulting stability persists even during periods without a romantic partner present at all. Someone who has genuinely rebuilt independent capacity maintains reasonably consistent routines, friendships, and self-care, regardless of their current relationship status, because that stability no longer depends on another person's presence to remain intact. Someone who has simply found a replacement scaffold, by contrast, tends to experience the same cascading collapse again, should that new relationship also eventually end, revealing that the underlying capacity was never actually rebuilt in the first place, simply externally restored through someone else's presence once more. Rebuilding routines, friendships, and self-care practices independently, without relying on another person's initiative and effort to hold them in place, represents genuinely significant psychological development, the kind that, if genuinely undertaken, produces someone considerably more capable of sustaining a healthy, balanced relationship in the future, precisely because their overall functioning no longer depends so heavily on a partner quietly performing this invisible scaffolding role. It's worth being honest, though, about the fact that this opportunity for growth isn't automatically seized simply because the collapse itself has occurred. Some avoidants do use this period to build genuine independence and self-sufficiency, developing their own routines, actively maintaining their own friendships, taking direct responsibility for their own physical environment and health in ways that ultimately produce a more resilient, self-sustaining foundation than existed before the relationship ever began. Others, however, simply search for a replacement, another partner willing, whether consciously or not, to step into the same scaffolding role, restoring external stability without ever actually developing the internal capacity to maintain that stability independently. This second path doesn't resolve the underlying vulnerability being described throughout this exploration.